Hi. This is the Android workshop for this hackathon. My Discord username is Bad Programmer, and I'll be hosting this. Yeah. For the table of content, so we're gonna first go through the setup. How you're gonna set up Android Studio and the emulator or external devices, so you can actually start programming and making Android apps. Then we're gonna go over some of the higher level theories and concepts that that might be unique for Android programming, and for those that's never had any experience with app development might be kind of difficult to, or require some explanation. And finally, we'll go through practice, which basically just means some looking at real life code examples as well as making our own Android app in the process. So yeah, let's get started. So setup. In this setup, I'll tell you how to install Android Studio and set up emulator and external device. So installing Android Studio. So most of the installation instructions can be found on this link here, and I guess I'll just go to the link here to kind of just show you. And basically, this link. So as you can see, there's 4 different instructions for 4 different operating systems, which means that Android Studio you can run it on Windows, Mac, Linux, and Chrome OS. And I'm assuming no one's gonna you probably won't be trying to run Android Studio on your Chromebook. But anyways, for Windows and Macs, I think the installation instruction is pretty generic. However, for Linux, it's a bit more specific, and I'll just kind of quickly demonstrate to you how how it's done. Right. So as you can see here, so I'm in my home directory, right? So usually, what would happen is when you download the Android Studio, you would end up having this zip file. Your compressed file, zip file that contains your Android Studio project, and Android and APK tool, these folders, right? And you'll extract it to a certain directory in your computer. So in my case, I extract it to my home directory. So hence where I am right now, right? And basically, to be able to actually run your Android Studio for the first time, you need to manually navigate through the application directory and start the script located in the bin folder. So I'll just show you how to do that. So you navigate into Android Studio, this folder, and as you can see, there's a couple folders, some files in here, and what you're going to do next is you're going to go into bin. This stands for binary, and this here contains some more scripts and stuff for running the starting the IDE. And basically what you can do is you can just run bash and studio.sh, and runs this script. Now I'm not going to run that because I already have Android Studio running in the background, but actually, yeah, that's just kind of another thing. As you can see, I have it running in the background. It is right now taking around 5.3 gigs of RAM. So usually that's based on how much I usually use, that's around like 2 gigs of extra 2 gigs of extra memory being used for Android Studio. And that's for some computers that might be actually pretty intensive. So if you have, like, say a super old computer with only 2 gigs of memory, you might not want to install Android Studio and try to run it. Yeah. So emulators and external devices. So to actually be able to test and debug your Android app, you're going to need an emulator or an external Android device and a cable to actually do so. Now, most phones, or most phones called the Android phone colloquially, that's what they're called, are known for the fact that they run the Android operating system. Now, you might have a Huawei or a Xiaomi, and in the system settings they might say Xiaomi OS or Huawei OS. I don't know what they're called specifically, but basically they're all just like sort of Android Studio reskins, Android reskins pretty much. So the stuff you write in Android Studio, it'll run on there fine for the most part, depending on what their Java API level is, but that's another story. Now, for all phones, you'll need to enable developer mode and USB debuggings in the settings to be able to actually access your phone from your computer and have your Android Studio be able to debug the app on your phone. Now, that instruction kind of varies depending on what phone you have, but for the most part, generally what happens is you go into your settings, you do some kind of special action that starts the developer mode, and then in developer mode, in the advanced setting, you change your you enable USB debugging, and that's how it works. Now, for emulators, I believe Android Studio comes installed with one, so you don't really need to worry about that. Now, what you do need to worry about or manage is download and manage AVDs, and you can do so already directly from Android Studio as well. So that's not really much of a big issue. But it should be noted that emulators are emulating an entire phone, so those do take a pretty significant amount of memory to run. So usually when I'm running an emulator and Android Studio at the same time, I'm basically capping out on my entire computer's memory, and I have 8 gigs of RAM total. So that's that if you have less than that, you might want to be a bit more careful about whether you want to use an emulator or not. So theory, this is some of the Android, so fundamental, higher level concepts and theories that you'll kind of encounter, when I'm going to later be going over through some of these source code and stuff. And I'm just going to try to explain it here so, I can kind of give you a foundation for perhaps. And these 2 links are they're from like the official like Android or developer website. And, I just kind of, I took some quotes and stuff in there and, just kind of put it in a slide, but, I'll give my own explanation as well. So, yeah. But if you're interested in reading a full thing, here's the link. So, platform architecture. So, Android is fundamentally, it runs the Linux kernel, right? So it's like a version of Linux. You have the Linux kernel on the bottom, and this is what's called the software stack. So you have, the kernel on the bottom here, handles the, communication between software and hardware, I/O and stuff. So, it's hardware, so like camera and your audio and your screen and whatever, right? And you have the hardware abstraction layer. I've never really encountered that, and, I haven't really encountered, or, while I'm writing Android code, I've never really considered these. So, when you're actually writing Android code, for the most part, you'll actually be dealing with the Java API framework the most. And, that's where you're going to see some of these very specific terms and, concepts. So, for example, activity, that's what's called a fundamental component in an Android app. A component, one of the 4 basic components of an Android app. And, that's where you're going to be seeing these more specific terms. And I just kind of want to illustrate this to you because it kind of explains how, where a lot of these specific terms come from, as well as, how Android, how you'll see some practices, in Android later about how they're managing resources, and, this kind of explains it, because, it's a Linux architecture. Each Android app basically runs as a separate user, and running as users, they'll have different levels of privilege, and, if you don't have a background on Linux, that might be a bit more difficult to understand, but, yeah, basically. So activities, according to the official website, an activity is the entry point for interacting with the user. It represents a single screen with a user interface. For example, an email app may have one activity that shows a list of new emails, another activity to compose an email, and another activity for reading emails, right? So an activity, as it said there, is just going to be a single screen, basically, when you see it. And what an activity, some of the common things that you would see an activity being used in an app would be, keeping track of what the user is currently doing, so what's on a screen. Knowing what previously used process contains things that a user may return to. So, like they'll have these kind of stacks that keeps tracks of all the activities that you've been through earlier, so they will know when you press the back button where you'll go. Helping the app handle having its process killed so the user can return to activity was the previous state restored, and providing a way for apps to implement user flow between each other and for the system to coordinate these flows. So, yeah. Now, services is a general purpose entry point for keeping an app running in the background for all kinds of reasons. It's a component that runs in the background to perform long-running operations or to perform work for remote processes. So, that would be kind of, so for example, say you have an app that needs to regularly poll this server for updates, right? To implement that, you're going to need to run that as a service. And, here this kind of gives the example of, music, or, music playing in the background as a service, and also, a service, or I guess they didn't really give the example of polling a web server, but yeah. And this is important that it runs as a background service, is because the system would to be able to manage the resource on the phone, they might need to sometimes have to the system will get to have the choice to decide when to kill some services so that they can free up some memory for other things. Yeah. Next one is broadcast receivers. So a broadcast receiver is a component that enables the system to deliver events to app outside of the regular user flow, allowing the app to respond to system-wide broadcast announcements. That doesn't really mean much, but the important part is, although broadcast receivers don't display a user interface, they may create a status bar notification to alert the user when the broadcast event occurs. So so usually when you work with broadcast receivers, you're basically just if you want to make a notification, you're gonna end up working with this stuff. There's also this last one called, I believe called content provider. I've never worked with it before, and I don't really think we need to learn this for the scope of this tutorial, so I'm just gonna skip that one. So practice. So so right now we're just gonna go over
I'm gonna go over 3 code samples, and in each sample I'll explain like 3 different topics. So in the first sample, I'm gonna explain, give you an overview of how the IDE looks. So when you go into Android Studio, what button does what, where to find what and whatever. An explanation of kind of how the project directory is structured, because how it's structured is a bit unique, and I do think it requires some explanation. Sample 2 would be an anatomy of an activity, an anatomy of a layout. So I would pull up in the sample or activity with some like kind of just describe to you what each part of the activity does, and what each function does, as well as the layout. So I'll explain what a layout is and when we get there, and as well as how to kind of manipulate the layout, and how you can actually code it. And the third one is services, threading, and animation. Now these topics are a bit more deep, so I won't go too much in depth in them, but I'll just give you kind of an idea of what they are like. So maybe if you're interested, you could look into that more on your own time. Yeah. So the first example, production code from an open source project. So as you can see, so this is an open source project I've been working on. It's called Tree Houses on GitHub. You can check it out yourself. This code is open source, and you can just download it from Google or GitHub for free. But basically, I'm just going to kind of show you, how the how the IDE works. So as you can see, the top bar, you have your menu bar, right? You have your files here. You can use the file to open projects, import projects, create new activities, and that kind of goes back to earlier the activity, and these are the kind of describes different variations of, you can think about from an abstract point of view, strings, or sorry, not strings, I mean screens. So yeah, as you can see here, you can use here to enable power save mode. So if your computer doesn't have a lot of battery, you can use that, or change how your text look to save some processing power. Yeah, but generally you'll be dealing with this. Now the contents of this kind of changes depending on where you are relative in a project directory, which is why I'm going to go over that later. But I'll demonstrate to you how it changes later. Edit, pretty typical. For the most part, these you won't use all of them obviously all the time, but the ones you'll use most common would be run. So right here there's kind of a quick bar, and you might have to use navigate as well sometimes, but yeah. Okay, so that's the menu bar, and this is actually this is a secondary menu bar. That's how I call it. This here kind of just how you run your app, right? So these are the configurations from which you can run your app. And usually how an app runs is, it'll start from like the main activity. So how like in C there's int main, right? That's the function that runs everything. It's kind of a similar thing with the main activity. By default, they'll have an entry point. Usually it's main activity if you're just doing normal apps, but yeah. And you can configure these, but I believe in default they have this configuration kind of app, so you could just use that one. Here is the list of devices you have available to you, and these two are both AVDs, so I can run them on an emulator. If I had a phone plugged in here right now, I would be able to see a third device, but I don't really have one around right now, so I can't really do that. And kind of just a open AVD manager. Sorry, just take a bit of right. So right. So as you can see. So this is, I was talking about the emulator and virtual devices, and this is basically how you're going to manage that. And I have Pixel 2 API 29. That's the Android API version. I'll go over that more in depth later. And these are different screen sizes, different API versions, and the targets, and how large they are. And you can add new ones using create virtual device, and you can just pick from. There's a pretty good list here. Yeah. So and then here's the actual button you can use to run the app. This is the this is apply changes and restart activity. This is different from like pressing stop and then restarting it. It takes less time. It's a debugger. Yeah, you can use your app in the debug mode as well. I haven't used that a lot, but yeah. And so on the side here, there's the Gradle scripts, and these are basically like specific. These are basically like tasks you can run, or sorry, scripts you can run to do certain tasks. So for example, if you want to run like a signing report, you can run this right now, and then it will run it using it will run the script, and then it will give you like a signing report that basically says, what kind of like a signature do you have you sign on your APK. But that's a bit more in depth, and we won't really need to. You don't need that to just start developing. So yeah, you can look at this more in depth on your own time. And on the bottom here, we have the terminal. So you won't usually use this a lot because your app's going to be running on a phone or an emulator, so that usually doesn't do much. But yeah, as you can see, I'm in my current project directory. I have my app, and actually, yeah, that's actually, since I'm here, I'm just going to show anyway. So as you can see, there's a bunch of these Gradle files. Now, obviously, you won't be able to see. I mean, well, most of them are coupled in here. But when you look at an Android app just from like your file system or file manager, you won't actually be able to see how it's structured quite differently. So if you go into app, you'll see that you have bundle.gradle pro guard rules pro, and then release source. Now, I mean, you don't see release or source here, right? You only see app. And actually, what you need to do is you'll need to cd into source to be able to see main, and then cd into main again. And this is where they're going to show you kind of where the code's going to be at. So you'll have your manifest.xml. I'll go over that later. Your res, so resources, and as well as Kotlin. So that's going to be where your actually, yeah, so that's going to be where your code's at. And so as you can see, sorry, that took a while. So this is the code being listed here is the same as the code being listed here, right? So but this just kind of illustrates how you'll need the Android IDE or Android Studio IDE to be able to actually properly look at or effectively navigate your project directory and be able to discern it. Logcat is this is basically, if you're running from an emulator or a phone, this will just show all the log output from your phone, and that would be like for example, if your main app is taking up too much resources, you'll get like a warning in here that says main thread too much work. And you can also, if you just run like print statements in your own code, this is going to be where it's going to come out. So yeah, you're going to have this open a lot. The rest here, I don't usually use them that much. I do believe Android Studio has Git, supports Git, but I usually just open terminal and do it from there. So yeah. So okay, so that's basically an overview of the IDE. Now let's go over the project's direct structure. So as I've said earlier, the project structure is quite unique. So in here you have first a manifest file, and you have Android manifest.xml, and this just kind of like it's like a manifest file in like these web apps, kind of talks about what kind of permission they need, maybe specify which each different activity does, and the theme. It's kind of yeah. You don't usually need to work with this too much, but if you're working with, like, say, for example, if you need like permission to access the internet, you might need to add a line in here or there and change stuff. And if you want your activity to start in like a specific version, so maybe start in like a specific orientation or theme, then you'll also need to do it in here too. And Java. Now this is called Java. It's a bit. It's actually Kotlin. This project happens to be written entirely in Kotlin, so I don't really know why it's called Java. But as you can see, this is where all the basically like code is located, right? So you have your code here. I don't personally program in Kotlin, so I'm not really familiar with this stuff, which is why I'm not using this project as a demonstration of how the code works. But yeah, basically you have these folders that kind of specify different modules. So for example, this is the SSH module, and this kind of handles like a particular activity. This is structured in a bit of an advanced way, in the sense that it doesn't have it has these adapters and doesn't have just straight up activities, and rather has fragments. But for it does have activities, but compared to like, it's mainly based on fragments. But overall, basically, this is a bit of a too advanced, so I'm not going to use this obviously as an example of how a typical Android app would be structured as, but just an illustration of how the folders are structured, or directory. So yeah, so this is the code part of it. So if you're like, for example, making a web request or doing calculations, you're gonna write some file, you're gonna write some code, and you're gonna put it in here. And then you have these things called assets, and I don't actually really know what that one does. I've never seen it. And then you have res. So this stands for resources, and these kind of just has Now, when you look at here, you're going to see a bunch of folders, and you might be kind of confused, or like, oh my god, which, it's a bit confusing. But the most important ones that you're going to use for the most part is layouts, because this basically just describes what each of your screen is going to look like, right? this is a searching screen, home fragments. This is what the home layout looks like. And if you press here, split, up here, yeah, you can only do this with the layouts, but basically, you can take a look at how it's kind of like HTML, but except it's XML, and it just defines how these things are, how it's looking here. You can either edit this using directly the code, which is the version I prefer, or you can just edit this using like dragging and stuff, and there's a pretty large amount of support for that. So yeah, I'll go over this more in depth than the other one, but basically you have your code. So like the code that actually, the code, and then you have your kind of graphic design pretty much. Yeah, so that's the first app, okay. Right. The second example we're gonna do is a personal portfolio app that I've done in the past for this internship. I chose this app because I think it's a pretty illustrative of how a typical activity. It's pretty simple. It's not that difficult since I made it a long time, or I made it when I just first started programming in Android. Straightforward, not too difficult, and I think it does a good job illustrating my points. So yeah, here it is. So as you might recall from earlier, I'm going to talk about an anatomy of activity and then an anatomy of a layout. So let's get started. Right. So as I said earlier, the activities or the code is all located in here, the Java folder, not in the res folder. And this is the main activity. This is the one This is the one that gets made by default in the empty activity. And as you can see, this looks like a bit of a mess, and it is because it's quite I've done some major changes in it. But I'll just kind of walk through what the code does line by line, right? So first off, this will get generated by default. Most of this function, public class main activity, this class app compact activity will get generated on default, and you're gonna have on create in here generated, on default, made by default as well. You'll get to see this later when we make our own app. So here you can define some variables and different to be able to actually interact with the there's a couple different ways you can interact between the activities and the layouts. You can either use these built-in functions in that layouts where you can just associate a button press with a certain function, or you can physically actually track the layout by their ID, which I'll go over more in depth more later. But yeah, so actually I think a helpful thing right now actually would be me showing to you the layout this activity corresponds to, and just kind of explaining to you what each different parts of the layout does. So let me just open that layout. I believe it's called main. Let me just right, okay. So let me see, can I, okay, I can't do that. Right, okay, so it's menu. Yes, so as you can see, so basically, so main activity corresponds to this layout, right? So in this layout, as I've said earlier, you can look at this from both the code or graphically. But basically, so this layout is consists of a linear layout, which is it's kind of like a tag in HTML, and basically what linear layout does is it makes, here, let me just write this in script actually. So if you if I remember correctly, that's for commenting. Yeah, so let's say you have an image here, right? You have an image, you got a button. In my case, you have a button and then you have a text, right? So how are they oriented relative to each other? How do you know which one's on top, which one's on the bottom? Well, it's linear, right? So right now, if you look at the physical script, this is the uppermost box here, right? This is a space I basically inserted in here, and then this is the second thing. This corresponds to that, right? And then this one's the third one. This corresponds to that, right? And basically, when in linear layout, the directionality of your code is, the ordering of your code is determined by where it is located relative in your XML file, right? So for example, if I want text to go on top, if I want this part to be on top, I would just copy this and move it over here, right? Now this is going to be on top. Now obviously the scaling might be a bit off, but otherwise, yeah. And as was any other layouts in Android, or sorry, with Android, you can have nested layouts and have layouts within layouts. So in this case we have vertical orientation and linear layout. So that means the layout's organized from top to bottom. You can also have horizontal, so you have the layout organized from in here from left to right. So yeah, so okay, right. So this is the layout. So but back to main activity, right? So as you can see, when I first start my before I even call my onCreate function, I have these variables to declare. I declare the linear layout, M layout. I declare the animation drawable. These are all if you've done Java programming, you'll know these are all classes corresponding to or declaring just a new class. I have a static private int RC signin. This is just some kind of number I had to use. Private static string final default web client ID. Yeah, so this is this is a you don't really need to know this, but this is specific for like if you're doing Google sign in. So in the case of my app, I actually have a Google sign in thing, so I need to do that, but we're not going to obviously do that in an example. So yeah, and this is just a Google sign in class or sign in options class, and I just had some of these special parameters. So yeah, so onCreate function, this is the function that gets this is the method, method that gets run whenever your activity starts, right? It's onCreate, hence the name, right? And it will send content view. So this basically just sends the activity, the layout of this activity associated with it to this one, right? So first super onCreate save instances. You don't really need to know that. M layout equals find view by id r.id.mains, right? So right now it's saying that the linear layout I earlier declared here would be associated with mains, right? So if we do Control F and we look up mains in here, so voila, this is the linear layout, right? And this linear layout basically is the entire layout that you see here. It contains everything, the text, the image, everything I said earlier. It's right here, right? So, as I've said before, this, if you've done, web development, this is probably pretty familiar concept to you. Finding things by ID or class, or well, we don't do class in Java, but just ID and stuff. And animation drawables. This is just setting some special parameters, just like adding some special parameters and set duration and whatever to the animation drawable class I just declared earlier. We don't really need to know that, but yeah. So far, just to reiterate, so far what I've explained is you have your this is the basic this is what a typical activity looks like, right? You have an activity class. You have an onCreate method that gets run whenever your activity is called via an intent. Oh, I probably should have said that, explained that earlier. Or whenever your activity is ran, basically. And whenever your activity is ran, it's going to display the script or display a layout that you can set here. Set content view. So yeah, so within the activity, you can also have other methods here that you can invoke to carry out specific functions. So for example, onActivityResult is when your activity is closed, when you're about to shut down your activity, you can you'll use the built-in function called or not built-in, sorry, this predefined method called onActivityResults, or the name at least. Oh yeah, and by the way, yeah, so you can't onCreate, these are like kind of I guess you can say, well, keywords wouldn't really be exactly accurate, but pretty much keywords, right? You can't change these method names, otherwise they won't work. So yeah, just make sure, Android Studio, it's an IDE, so it'll help you do that on its own, but just keep in mind, if you change this to say just activity results, it's not going to work. But basically, so you have these keyword sort of quote unquote methods here that basically does different parts, or that basically handles different part of the life cycle of an activity. So you have this part that handles when the activity is created, this part that handles when the activity is almost done, and this part that handles the activity when on destroy, when it's closing. Okay. So now, so you might wonder, okay, cool, that's cool and all, but what am I, how am I going to actually program the activity? Like, what am I going to use to program the activity itself? So if I press a button, I want to do something, how am I going to do it? Well, here it is. You have these different methods in here that can be called from the or that can be access, or that can be activated from the by the layout via these buttons. So for example, if you take a look at this button, right? This button, it has on click, right? And this is so basically what this says is, when you click this button, you'll invoke the Google sign-in method inside main activity. And in our case, this is the Google sign-in method. right? And when this happens, this is just gonna call some other method from earlier. And I mean, well, in this case, we're pretty simple because we literally have only one button, so that's a bit of a simple use case. But and a lot of times you'll have a lot of you have so let's say here, let's just take a look at the menu, right? So in the menu you'll see there is a bunch of smaller methods in here. Why? Because these are all methods that corresponds to a button press. So if you look at the menu layout, you'll see that there's 4 buttons. So every time you press a button, you end up starting a method here in somewhere or one of these methods. And actually, that brings me to another part. How do you transition between activities, right? So let's just say, okay, I start my app main activity, right? I get into this main activity layout. I see this button, I log in. I go through the whole Google API login thing. That they have it handled automatically, right? And then you log in, right? And okay, done, right? What do you do next, right? You logged in. What do you do next? Well, what you do is you use an intent. Let me just. I don't have an intent. That is very odd. But yeah, so so you basically you create an intent, and then see, there you go, intent. You create an intent, and you intended this class, right? You have this new intent, and this is how you declare a class in Java. And you declare a new class, and you have intent parentheses, and you're initializing a new intent that has you're starting from this, so this class main activity.java, and then you're trying to start menu.class, which basically refers to this file menu.java, right? And then what you can do is you can use a special method called start activity, and you can just start this intent, and basically you can you'll basically start menu, and then your app will transition from activity domain to activity menu. Yeah, I mean, right now, as I'm explaining, this might seem a bit difficult to follow, and that's all right because it's I think it's really hands-on is the best way to teach. But yeah. So that pretty much actually just concludes the typical activity and a typical layout, how it works. I'll go more in depth obviously when we actually do the app demonstration, but yeah, that was pretty much it. So personal portfolio, and finally the development code of an education app. So this was the internship. This is the code from the internship where where I wrote the portfolio you were looking at earlier for, and I just kind of want to use this because this code kind of illustrates 2 points. First thing, it has a good amount of samples, kind of just demonstrating some of these more difficult these more advanced techniques and things you can do with Android app. But also it kind of just illustrates how simple code can take you a long way in Android Studio. So as you can see, the typical project structure. I have these Java files here, containing the different activities. And some of them aren't activities; they're actually services, and which is actually one of the things I'm going to demonstrate. So just to recap. So sample 3 will show you services, threading, and animation, right? So let's get started. So services. So in here I have this class called listener, right? And you can tell that this is a service instead of an activity because up here it has public class listener extends intent service, right? Instead of say public class home extends activity compact activity, right? So this is, you can immediately tell the difference. And basically in this in this service, basically what you do, in here I'm just using the service to do some fetching, pulling this web server. But how you can run this is you can start this using an intent from like another activity, from I believe in this code, I believe it was started listener. I think I misspelled listener. Yeah, so I started listener here using using an intent, and so yeah, services, services, and then the background intent and like activities can all be started with intent. Right, so that was just the services. So something that stays in the background while you run the app. And then another thing I have, and then the next one is the threading. Right, so right here, this should technically be implemented as a service as well because this is running in the background. But basically, this is the class I use to make web requests to the web server. Now you can't do web requests in the actual activities themselves, because the thing is, web request, you need to run it on a separate thread from the main application thread. And it's a bit more it's a bit complex on how. So for example, if you take a look at Flex, right? Okay, so I could declare a new version of the class, right? So I called API con, right? So right, so I declared a new version of API con, but when I actually run it, when I actually run the API con, okay, right here, you can see I don't, it looks pretty normal. I just run API con, and then I use a Z, and then I call these I call these methods. But if you actually take a look at within API con, I have this entire secondary class here that basically opens it up in a new thread and then runs it from class post extends async task, right? So this is a separate thread from the main application thread, and basically this just runs the whole web service, or sorry, fetching thing on a separate thread. So yeah, that's kind of just this demonstration of that concept. And finally is animation. So so I guess for animation I'll use this example here. So attendance overview. So animation, honestly, in my opinion, is a bit janky in Android Studio. And you could, you've probably seen, if you remember earlier from the first sample code, you could run animation, you declare as a class, and then you give it some preference, or feed it some values, and then you can set where it goes and whatnot. But there's actually a lot of different ways you can do animation. You don't actually have to use an animation class. There's a lot of other ways, if you will, you can cheese it. So here, let me give you an example. So let's go into layouts, and I'll show you like a sample of a class that I have an animation for. So let's see, I think I have an animation class for Flex. Yeah, Flex. Oh, sorry, not that. There. Okay, so as you can see, okay, so it might not be obvious at first. Sorry, it's building. But all right, so when this app actually runs, you won't actually be able to see any of this, right? So right now I have essentially 3 layers of layouts on top of each other, right? This linear layout covers the first part, so this covers the bottom. So if I were to let's see, if I were to comment this out, right? If I were to comment this out, you would just not see it at all. And this is basically what the Flex class itself looks like, right? This is what you will get when you first get into the app. And then when you actually run the app, you're going to include, right down here, you'll probably see I included another class called Flex Card. But since Flex Card right now is set as invisible, you won't actually be able to see it in Activity Flex. And obviously, this is a bit of a more difficult programming concept, so I'm not going to go in too deep in depth. But basically, what I'm trying to say here is this is a lot of different ways you can achieve animations in Android Studio, and you don't always have to use the Android default animation class. So yeah.